Hey, welcome back, everybody. It's John Arnold here. A quick hello from me and my colleague, Chris Fine. Hey, Chris.
Hey, John, great to be back as always.
Yeah, same here. So we're doing another podcast segment, and we are at this stage really getting into year two of our little endeavor here, and we know we've got some branding to do, and that could be a topic unto itself someday. But we are, I think, finding a bit of a groove in how we do these things, and we have always got interesting things to talk about. So, we are going to do on this segment something that's come out of an article I recently wrote, but hasn't been published quite yet, but will be very soon. And it sparked some conversation about issues I hadn't thought about until I got feedback from my peers. And I think Chris and I can expand on this topic quite a bit, and we'll try to address that here. So what I'm getting at is this idea of collaboration, which is pretty central to my focus as an analyst. And it certainly ties into a lot of your, digital workplace work, right, Chris?
Yes, absolutely.
And it's definitely become a strategic buzzword. Collaboration sounds good on paper. It makes executives feel good when you say, okay, we're using collaboration technologies, but really it doesn't add up to anything unless the end users, the workers, actually collaborate and produce good work, because the tools themselves don't guarantee a good outcome, right? I mean, people still have to do the work unless it's all AI driven, but that's another topic. But anyways, what I want to get at here is the idea of collaboration is, we think we know what it means, but it is a very fluid concept. And it's fluid not just because the nature of work is hard to define, but because as new technologies emerge, especially out of the cloud and AI for that matter, the concept of collaboration itself is being reshaped by the technologies that are available to us. So in other words, we're able to work in ways we couldn't work before, which has created not only just new ways of collaborating, but also new use cases that really we didn't give much thought to before, mainly because the technologies weren't as pervasive as they are today. But in today's world, it touches everything we do, everywhere we go, et cetera, so that now we have new capabilities that just didn't exist. And that's taken us to companies like Slack, who have entered the market with their own version of what some would call collaboration. And that's what we want to get to on this podcast today, Chris, right? The definition of collaboration is fluid, and that's a good thing, but it's also a messy thing, and that makes life hard for decision makers and IT when it comes to planning digital transformation and improving productivity in the workplace. So the other side of what we call collaboration is known as Workstream communications, which focuses more on processes, right? And this comes a lot out of the project management world, where the focus is on executing a series of tasks in the most efficient way possible to get the outcome that is more or less known in advance. And that requires different tools, different ways of working, but there's a lot of blurring going on in the marketplace because the technologies can be used to do both things. And I think we just want to spend some time today talking about kind of where this creates opportunity, but also distinguishing a little bit more between what these two ways of working really mean. Right, Chris? So I'm sure you've seen some of this too in your work.
Sure, it's something we have to think about all the time when it comes to designing any kind of workplace or accommodating different work tasks and styles, John. So it's very often about how do you balance creation versus production. So when you're collaborating, if you really wanted to oversimplify things, you might think of two modes, as you said. I'm going to plan what to do and then I'm going to do it. And what I found is that for some years, it's a lot of this there's still a lot of email out there, but in real-time communications is being used more and more in both types of work, or both types of modes of function, if you want to call it that. And so, as usual, when you're using a general purpose tool, it has strengths and weaknesses in both modes. And so the question is, how can these systems evolve to seamlessly flip back and forth or transition and do both better, or do each better, I should say. Don't you think that's kind of where things are headed?
Hmm. Well, yeah, and the nature of work itself, as we know, is changing, and I think where this becomes difficult for IT folks to really address effectively is that so much of work now is very user centric, and individuals have a lot of agency over how they work, who they work with, and how the work gets done. So, it's not like one person controls all the tools. We all have all the tools. We can all be team leaders, and that does make it kind of messy sometimes in terms of getting things done efficiently. So this is a case where, if you have too many tools, it actually may be counterproductive because they just get in the way of just letting people do what's needed. So what I want to kind of cite, I mentioned Slack, and not to dwell on them too long, but I was at their Frontiers conference in late March, I think it was, and they like to be very out there with their messaging because they've grown so quickly. They're going into IPO mode, so a lot of momentum is going their way, which is great. But they really can be viewed as simply a disruptive force because they are running up against all of the incumbent vendors who have dominated the collaboration space with UC for so long. And it's important to understand where they fit into this kind of value chain. And they are talking up a lot about collaboration, mainly because enterprise is an important growth market for them. They really need to go up market and get those larger organizations using Slack, and more importantly, paying for using Slack. So they have to come across appealing to what's important to enterprises, and collaboration is a big deal. So you have to be careful when companies talk about collaboration, what they're actually trying to get at. In Slack's case, as I mentioned, it's a lot of people would agree it's more about work streams, workflows that it enables, and they themselves will tell you they're not directly competing with UC. They're not trying to replace UC. It's just good. It's very good for certain ways of working, as is UC. And in fact, Slack views email as actually their biggest competitor, but we can leave that for now. What I wanted to get at, and we'll go from here, Chris, is one of the examples they showcased was a very unique situation. It's a restaurant called Single Thread, and they're very famous as being a very, very innovative form of farm to table dining, and they're based in Sonoma Valley. It has all that kind of cachet. But what was really interesting is their chef and co-founder Kyle Connaughton was interviewed on stage by Guy Raz from NPR, and the idea was to talk about how they use Slack in their operations. And I thought, what better way to showcase other ways that collaboration kind of can be viewed than something as unconventional as a restaurant. You wouldn't think of that as requiring collaboration. And what I want to get to here, Chris, is there's collaboration and there's workflows. So what's really going on here? And a lot of this is workflows, but it is still a collaborative process. And so there's again, that fluidity in the term collaboration can be misleading. But I just found this was a very interesting example of they have needs to execute tasks as much as any organization or office space does, and Slack works very well for them. So that's a good way to show, hey, there's another way to think about collaboration, and look at the results you're getting. And when you're talking about a top-end restaurant, this is one of 15 Michelin 3-star restaurants in the country. When you're at that level of performance, it says something that they'll rely on a technology like this to help them get those outcomes. So that's the example I wanted to cite. And I know you've seen similar. You obviously see a lot more of this in the enterprise world, but the needs are the same, right?
Well, there are some overlapping things that are interesting, and also trends reflected in your story. So when you think about a restaurant like that and an operation like that that's farm to table, it has certain similarities to things like just-in-time manufacturing and a mass customization of production.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you think about where the trends are going in actual production, they're similar. And what you end up having is whatever that industry or that operations equivalent is to sort of what DevOps is to software, where it's very much real time, very much we're checking with each other. And if you go back a few years, there was a famous book, which is I would highly recommend reading, called The Goal, about how this could be applied to production. And this was the gold standard of thinking about just in time, quickly compensating, changing, iterating kind of production. And there's a newer book too called The Phoenix Project. It's excellent on that with reference to software development. But what you're saying, John, the way I hear it is not only is that a great use of a tool like Slack, but the way what they're trying to deliver for their customers sounds very much in line with trends in general, and thus it would make a lot of sense for them to use more modern, real-time, collaborative tracking type tools. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah. And I think it's, important to note that, as I said, they have collaboration needs that are just, ultimately no different than any other organization. And what I want to impart here, one of the messages, is that if you focus strictly on the technologies used for collaboration, you won't see these opportunities. My view is instead, if you want to talk about collaboration or workflows for that matter, to me, it's better. It's more useful to focus on the outcome you want to deliver, and then you work backwards to figure out what tools are available. Because any platform can give you, 10, 20 different tools, voice, data, video, etc. But you only need certain tools for certain tasks. And in this case, if the outcome is deliver this seamless experience where the diners arrive, everything is ready for them, it's an effortless experience, take friction out of the process, then you look at how the workflows are structured, that dictates the tools that you need. So, for example, they have people in the field out by the farm next door that will literally pick the fruit or the vegetables and using their mobile phones, show the chef, here's what we've got, which one should we take? So you could literally customize every piece of fruit that might go into that salad or whatever and say, okay, is it this apple or this apple that we're going to use? And so they could customize everything in real time for the specific needs of, say, a specific meal, or it might be a party, whatever. And this goes on endlessly in terms of using, as you said, Chris, the real-time capabilities of these technologies to make the end result look effortless. But the orchestration going on behind the scenes is pretty complex and relies on these tools. You couldn't do it without it. It wouldn't be the same. So if you compare that to another, maybe a different farm-to-table restaurant that doesn't use these technologies, they'll give you a good experience. And it would be very memorable, but then think about what's possible. This is the creativity that comes in to say, if we use technology to take this a level further, this can be an even better experience, and here's what it looks like.
Well, it's interesting in any industry, I think, and this is disclaimer, my point of view, that you think about the experience. You said the key word, right? So when we think about, for example, future office or smart office, we think about, what are we trying to deliver? What does the population who's going to occupy this space and use this space or manage or operate this space need to accomplish? And how can we make that an optimal experience? And in your farm to table example, it's interesting that you'd have to think about it on two dimensions. But one is, yes, I know, to your point about technology for its own sake, yes, you could definitely implement technology that would produce that real-time salad, but then how do you make that experience overall benefiting from that technology a lot better than some of the most famous farm-to-table restaurants that just do it on a daily basis? I have these greens today. I went and picked them fresh this morning. Everybody who gets salad today is going to get these greens. And is that incremental difference from either an actual gastronomic or marketing or both standpoint worth pursuing? And In this example, it seems that it has been, and they've benefited from the technology tools. But my guess is when they thought about this, they probably started from, what's the dining, culinary, gastronomic experience need to be? What is our goal? What do we seek to accomplish that differentiates ourselves and drives the state of the culinary art forward? And then how do we use the tools? Rather than, hey, there's Slack, right? And then what can you do with that in a restaurant?
Yeah, and this is where the creativity comes in, and this is what I'm trying to get to. Enterprise environments can be creative too. And it's not that Slack came to them and said, here are the apps you should use, right? And map it out for them. Rather, no, they know the jobs, they know the tasks. So this is what makes this more of a workflow example, right? And say, okay, well, this is what we need. Well, the waiters need to know certain information about the customer, get that in advance from customer, give them an easy way to share that information. And then what the waiters do is they have Slack on their Apple Watches so they can communicate very seamlessly and be, when needed in the restaurant, but it's not distracting, right? This is again another way that the technology stays kind of transparent behind the scenes. Let the servers be in the moment with the customer rather than constantly checking, making phone calls or whatever. They're right there in the moment. So that engagement level goes much higher. And that again is part of the experience. As you said, Chris, the food is one thing, but it's the overall environment that also is part of that experience.
It's the overall experience from the diners and the operators. And, we kind of didn't mention this, but also how does this allow you to reduce your costs? And if you go back to DevOps and then you go back to real-time manufacturing, that was another big goal. And same with Smart Office. How do you avoid all this crazy empty space with underutilized, expensive, and you have to hold it on your balance sheet and all of this other stuff that doesn't really make sense in a real-time world. And so, those are the advantages as well. And that's part of the ROI case that operates in tandem with the experience case.
Yeah. Okay, so my main takeaway here is certainly for buyers out there, IT decision makers, the idea about collaboration, my message for them is think more broadly about what's possible. Just because your incumbent vendor tells you this is what's out there, you have to consider other ways of working, maybe other use cases for it. So let the outcomes, as I mentioned earlier, dictate what you need. So there's some homework that they need to be doing to determine what those use cases are. And also make sure, keep this user experience part of it front and center. Let the end users, let the workers kind of define how these workflows get shaped. And they'll collaborate more effectively that way. So this is let the human creativity come through, give them the tools, but keep it as fairly, try to make it a transparent experience, not one that's technology driven. And then finally, keep in mind that this word collaboration is muddy. And so be wary of vendors if they're talking about collaboration. Make sure that you are talking about the kind of teamwork you need in the office versus use cases that might be more workflow, which is still important too. But be careful how the vendors position those messages because it's easy to mix the two up. There are different forms of working. Slack is good for some things. UC is good for other things. Both are important in the environment to stay for the overall outcome, of course, which is to make the organization more agile. There's going to be use cases for both.
Agreed, John. And I think as we look forward, there's going to be more and more availability of good tools for process-based collaboration. You can see the trends. You can imagine that companies like Slack and many others are going to focus more on process based on user demand and opportunity. And then, there's a whole other podcast we could do about how AI might add into that. But I agree with you 100%. And I think IT certainly going forward has to be tied into the end user experience. And it's a tough job because you have to still think about that plant. You have to think about all of your requirements and security and a million other things, but you can't go from the inside out without thinking about the outside in.
Okay. Well said. Good way to conclude. And yes, that's a good teaser. Bring AI into this conversation for another podcast. All right. So with that, we are going to sign off. So we thank you all for listening, and we not only hope that you listen to this, I hope you check out the transcripts we're adding to this as well. We'd love to hear your feedback on that. And as I've mentioned earlier, I think certainly in my newsletter that the archive of our podcasts from older ones is available you can check those out on my website. So we, obviously want you to take advantage of everything we're trying to talk about here. So we hope you listen to others as well. And otherwise, we'll catch you on the next podcast. So for now, I'll say goodbye. And Chris, you can do the sign off now.
Oh, great. Thanks, John. Thanks, as always, for having me on as your guest here. And I also just want to take a moment to thank our listeners. As John said, we've been now at this for a while. We've gotten lots of great feedback. We're open to ideas. And we just appreciate you giving us the time of day. And we'll be back soon. Thanks a lot.